I sat across from a young venture capitalist in a high-end San Francisco coffee shop last week. The air was, smelling of roasted beans and money, and he was casually explaining why he thought the complete collapse of the American political order wasn't just inevitable, but desirable. He wasn't angry or shouting like a radical on a street corner. In fact, he was terrifyingly calm. He looked at the coming chaos with the same detached optimism a developer might have when they're about to wipe a server clean to install a new operating system. He started drawing a diagram on a napkin loop. He talked about the fourth turning, this idea that history has a biological rhythm, an 80 years heartbeat that demands a crisis to regenerate. He spoke about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II, not as tragedies to be avoided, but as necessary system updates. But then came the twist that really unsettled me. He didn't want to prepare for the storm, he wanted to trigger it. Why wait, he asked, taking a sip of his $8 oat milk latte. If the system is buggy, you don't patch it, you crash it so you can ship the 2.0 version faster. That moment crystallized a strange paradox for me. Here was a man enjoying the peak comforts of a stable civilization. The expensive coffee, the safe streets, the global trade network, actively rooting for its disintegration. He viewed human history not as a river to be navigated, but as a product roadmap to be accelerated. It raised the chilling question: what happens when powerful people decide that the only way to build a future is to deliberately burn down the present?
That paradox you describe, it's absolutely crucial. The highly privileged actively advocating for civilizational disintegration, that is the exact rationale underpinning the ideology we need to understand today.
It's a mindset where stability is a bug, not a feature.
Exactly. And when you think like that, you have entered the world of accelerationism.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're looking at a really complex set of ideas here, from, obscure 1970s philosophy and Marxist theory all the way to manifestos straight out of Silicon Valley.
And reports on global extremist networks. This isn't just about some niche political movement.
No, not at all.
That's right. This is about defining accelerationism, or AAC, in all its complicated, sometimes contradictory forms. We need to track its philosophical history, see how it splinters into these starkly different variants.
Like the techno-utopianism of Silicon Valley on one hand.
And the far right's violent militancy on the other. And crucially, we need to understand how all these groups use these deterministic theories of history to rationalize the intentional dismantling of our social structures.
It's kind of a shortcut, isn't it, to understanding the intellectual foundations of the instability we're seeing all over the world right now.
It really is.
So let's start with the basics. When we talk about accelerationism, what is the core concept? Because it sounds less like a specific destination.
Like a specific social state or a capitalist republic, yeah.
Right, and more like an attitude, an obsession with speed itself.
That's the key distinction. It's not defined by its destination, but by its required velocity. It's a whole range of ideologies, really, that all call for using current processes, mostly, rapid technological change and the forces of global capitalism, to create radical social transformation.
So you don't fight the system, you use it against itself.
You move through it. You use its own destructive, self-overcoming nature rather than attempting the slow, gradual, agonizing process of reforming it from within. Speed is the solution.
And this isn't a new idea, not just something from the internet age. It has deep philosophical roots. Where does this formal philosophy really begin?
Well, we typically trace what they call the first wave back to the late 1960s, early 70s, with post-Marxist French thinkers.
Okay.
The key figures here are Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Their work, Anti-Oedipus, is absolutely foundational. They saw the revolutionary path as presenting this stark choice. On one hand, you could try to withdraw from the world market,
which they didn't like.
They saw it as this kind of nostalgic, almost fascist retreat. So the other option
was to lean in.
Exactly. To embrace the inherent turbulence of capital. They advocated for going still further to accelerate the process. It's a concept they explicitly linked to Friedrich Nietzsche's destructive philosophical impulse. They said capital has this immense revolutionary potential that, quote, the truth is that we haven't seen anything yet.
What do they mean by that?
They focused on what they called capital's deterritorializing force.
I mean,
the way it just constantly breaks down and dissolves fixed social, geographic, and cultural boundaries, all in its relentless pursuit of new markets and new resources. To them, this wasn't just chaos, it was the mechanism of true change.
That's fascinating. But if we dig even further back, it feels like the basic ideas of accelerationism, even if it didn't use the term, they really start with Karl Marx himself.
Oh, absolutely. Marx clearly anticipated the idea. If you look at his 1848 speech on the question of free trade,
Right.
he saw the free trade system as inherently socially destructive, but instead of opposing it, he argued for it.
Which seems counterintuitive.
It does. But he said the free trade system hastens the social revolution. It is in this revolutionary sense alone, gentlemen, that I vote in favor of free trade. He believed the destructive forces of capital, once unleashed, would push the conflict between classes to an extreme point, and boom, revolution.
So he saw capitalism as this necessary destructive tool, something to be used for historical acceleration.
Precisely. And this idea became even more explicit in his unpublished work, specifically the Fragment on Machines from the Grundrisse.
And this is considered his most overtly accelerationist writing.
It is. In it, Marx theorizes about the role of automation and fixed capital machines, knowledge, science, and production. He argues that as technology advances, general intelligence becomes the dominant productive force, which makes human labor increasingly obsolete.
So automation pushes capitalism past its own limits.
Exactly. It signals a crisis that eventually leads to a post-capitalist society of, radical leisure and abundance. It's a very accelerationist vision, using technology and capital's own tendency to overcome itself to just liquidate the existing social order.
So the idea is they're sort of simmering, just waiting for the right cultural conditions to explode.
And those conditions appear in the 1990s. This ushers in the second wave, driven by cybernetics, the internet, and figures like Nick Land.
Yes, Nick Land. This is where things take a very, very different turn.
A decisive, radical turn. Nick Land and the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, or CCRU, at the University of Warwick in the UK, they became the epicenter of the second wave. They fused posthumanism and 90s counterculture, so think cyberpunk literature, the aggressive, chaotic sound of jungle music. They fused all of that with accelerationist theory.
They weren't just academics in an ivory tower.
Not at all. They were cultural theorists who were deeply immersed in this sense of an impending technological singularity. And Land's thought, his thought becomes the dividing line. It's what transforms accelerationism from a post-Marxist critique into the foundation for its modern far-right and techno-capitalist variants.
Let's focus on Land's vision for a minute because it's such a radical, almost nihilistic break from even the most aggressive Marxist goals.
It is. Land's right-wing accelerationism sees unregulated capitalism not as this oppressive structure to be reformed or defeated,
But as the revolutionary force, the supreme one.
Yes, an entity that is separate from and ultimately indifferent to human interests. He saw capitalism as a positive feedback circuit, just perpetually revolutionizing itself toward exponential growth and eventually a technological singularity.
It's like humanity's just a temporary vessel, a biological bootloader for the machine intelligence that's coming.
That is the core of his vision, the inhuman outcome. Land advocated for the total, unapologetic abandonment of caution toward what he called the disintegrative processes of capital. He believed this trajectory would culminate in a techno-capital singularity, driven by breakthroughs in AI, biotech, human enhancement that would result in the eventual replacement of humanity with technology.
Nothing human makes it out of the near future. That's his line, isn't it?
A famous chilling dictum. Exactly. He sees human culture, democracy, emotion. It's all just dead weight. It needs to be dissolved so consciousness can migrate into this vast planetary techno-sentience reservoir.
So where did that kind of profound technological determinism lead him politically? I mean, it's one thing to have these ideas. It's another to build a political ideology around them.
It pushed him squarely into the neo-reactionary movement, which he helped found. It's sometimes called the Dark Enlightenment.
The Dark Enlightenment, right.
Land argued that the forces of democracy, egalitarianism, political correctness, they were simply decelerators, just braking mechanisms designed by weak-willed humans to slow down the inevitable, glorious techno-capital singularity.
And his solution?
His political solution was radical. He advocated for a form of capitalist monarchism where states are essentially controlled by a CEO, free to pursue long-term technological innovation without having to appease what he calls short-sighted public opinion for re-election.
So optimize the political system for speed, not for things like stability or human rights.
Exactly. And that sets the stage perfectly for where these ideas are showing up today.
We move from the dark, underground philosophy of Nick Land to its polished, massively funded cousin, Effective accelerationism, or
Right.
this is clearly the dominant strain operating inside Silicon Valley's powerful tech sector.
Heath Alley is the philosophy that wears this veneer of utopianism. It takes its inspiration from effective altruism, that movement focused on doing the most good possible, but it applies that maximizing logic only to technological progress.
The premise seems pretty straightforward.
It is. Technological progress should be unrestricted at all costs because only AGI and relentless innovation can solve all universal human problems. Poverty, war, the climate crisis, you name it.
It really does sound like a faith system. Technology is the savior and stagnation is the devil.
It functions exactly like that. The central dogma is articulated really well in Mark Andreessen's techno-optimist manifesto. Oh. His starting premise is this simple binary. Societies either grow or die.
Okay.
So given that population growth is flattening and natural resources are finite, he argues that technology is the only perpetual source of growth. For the techno-optimist, technology isn't just a tool, it's the glory of human ambition. It's the primary moral good.
And they elevate free markets to that same, almost spiritual level as technology. Why is the market so central to this vision?
Because they believe free markets are the most effective way to organize a technological economy. They call markets a discovery machine, a kind of decentralized intelligence.
And this is where they're pulling from economists like Friedrich Hayek.
Heavily. Specifically, his work on the knowledge problem.
Right. Can you just unpack the knowledge problem for a moment? Because it's so central to why they reject any kind of centralized governance.
Of course. Hayek argued that centralized planning, so think socialist models or even just overly bureaucratic regulatory bodies, is doomed to fail. Why? Because the central authority, which is removed from the daily, localized transactions of billions of people, suffers from the knowledge problem. It just cannot access or process the vast, dispersed, and often unspoken knowledge held by individual buyers and sellers.
But markets can.
Markets, in their view, are a decentralized system that organically harnesses that complexity. They allocate resources and promote innovation far better than any government agency ever could. So for the EAT crowd, decentralization is efficiency. Regulation is central planning, and therefore, it's failure.
I remember they even make this moral argument that innovation is inherently philanthropic. How on earth do they justify that when you see such immense wealth concentrated in the tech sector?
They use a very specific economic metric. They cite data claiming that the creators of technology, the innovators and entrepreneurs, they only capture about 2% of the economic value that's created.
Only 2%?
Right. The other 98%, the overwhelming majority, flows to society at large as a social surplus.
So they argue that innovation driven by markets is inherently philanthropic? By a 50-to-1 ratio.
Precisely. And this combination speed, market efficiency, technological progress is what Andreessen, borrowing Land's term, calls the techno-capital machine. They see it as the engine of perpetual material creation and abundance, all driven by the law of accelerating returns.
So, if this machine is designed to deliver infinite abundance, what are the obstacles? What do the techno-optimists see as the enemy of acceleration?
The enemy is deceleration. It's stagnation. They identify specific bad ideas that block the machine. Things like existential risk, sustainability, and this is the critical one, a precautionary principle. These concepts, they argue, prioritize stopping progress over realizing its benefits.
Okay, this brings us to a major point of analysis for our deep dive. When you have this whole philosophy coming out of Silicon Valley, this prioritization of rapid disruption and engineered societal evolution, what does that do to global market stability, to our traditional regulatory frameworks? The rejection of the precautionary principle seems absolutely integral.
It's the battleground. The precautionary principle for you, the listener, is the idea that if an action or product carries a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or the environment, the burden of proof that it is not harmful falls on those taking the action.
So you don't wait for the damage to be done and proven?
Right. It's an institutionalized way of asking, what if this breaks everything before you launch it?
Which, to an accelerationist, must sound like institutionalized stagnation.
Exactly. Andreessen calls it deeply immoral. He claims the principle is a powerful political tool used by decelerators to block basically all progress since the discovery of fire.
What's their main example?
Nuclear power. They argue that the precautionary principle and the regulatory hurdles it inspired effectively blocked civilian nuclear power development in the West. Andreessen calls it the most catastrophic single mistake in Western society in his lifetime.
Because it prevented the widespread clean energy that could have solved climate change decades ago.
That's the argument. So the e-expanding mandate is to reject this cautious approach and replace it with a permissionless, high-risk, high-speed approach to innovation.
They demand that the precautionary principle be jettisoned with extreme prejudice.
That's the quote. This stance prioritizes speed and risk, and it fundamentally destabilizes traditional regulatory frameworks, which are built around preventing unintended long-term consequences. Their goal is radical abundance, to push intelligence and energy to infinity, drive prices to zero.
And the implication is pretty chilling.
It is. Any delay or regulation that slows this constant upward spiral of innovation is seen as catastrophic. Because a technologically stagnant society, they claim, ruins everything. They even argue that preventable deaths caused by blocking life-saving AI, say, in medical diagnostics, should be viewed as a form of murder.
So risk isn't a cost to be avoided.
Risk is the price of salvation.
That is just a staggering reframing of safety regulation. But the critique that's leveled against this whole movement, despite all its utopian language of material abundance for everyone, is that it's just repackaged elitism. It's a bid for power disguised as progress.
And that criticism is essential. It connects Andreessen's modern ideology all the way back to the 19th century philosophical tradition of Friedrich Nietzsche's aristocratic radicalism. This tradition, which influenced a lot of thinkers obsessed with genius and power, is built on three pillars. First, the belief that a natural ruling elite exists.
Right.
Second, that the problem of modernity is that the masses refuse to submit to the directives of the superior class. And third, that civilization itself is in peril unless the elite dramatically reasserts its power.
So the tech founders and VCs become the modern version of Nietzsche's technological supermen.
Precisely. They absorb the traditional role of the great men of culture. They are the natural rulers because they understand and control the engine of perpetual growth, the techno-capital machine.
But the problem comes when you contrast Andreessen's claim of creating material abundance for everyone with Nietzsche's, well, his much more brutal core philosophy.
Exactly. Nietzsche himself argued that the progress of the cultural elite, the Olympian men, must necessarily be purchased at the expense of the vast majority, those he called the human misfires.
In other words, the cost of greatness is human subjugation.
Yes. The philosophical DNA here suggests a fundamental conflict. Progress for the elite requires costs for the masses. While modern techno-optimists try to claim their interests are aligned with everyone's, that we all benefit from abundance, the historical tradition they're drawing from suggests the opposite.
That the interests of the accelerating elite and the ordinary decelerating public are inherently in conflict.
Exactly. The accelerationist elite is pre-committed to its own superiority and its right to dominate the next phase of history, even if that requires discarding the bulk of current civilization.
So we've established the right-wing extremism of Nick Land and this techno-capitalist version, Eastwing. Now we have to look at the third major philosophical stream, left-wing accelerationism,
Yeah.
which wants to seize the machine for entirely different ends.
Right. Left-tech is the third wave. It was formalized by thinkers like Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams, who published the #Accelerate manifesto for an accelerationist politics. Their goal is to accelerate past capitalism by seizing and repurposing its most advanced features, sophisticated automation, planning technologies, cybernetics, to achieve a socialist or post-capitalist society.
So they see late-stage capitalism as stagnant, as holding back technology's true liberating potential.
That's the core idea, and they're very critical of the existing left's organizing methods.
What specifically do they critique?
They argue fiercely against what they call folk politics. This includes things like localism, direct action, horizontalism, any strategy that prioritizes local community building over systemic global change.
So small-scale actions are pointless in their view.
The manifesto explicitly says the left must embrace abstraction, complexity, globality, and technology to achieve meaningful change. They can't remain content just establishing these small, temporary, non-capitalist spaces within the capitalist system.
So they want to leverage big data and sophisticated planning tools, the kind usually associated with big corporations or governments, to manage a global post-capitalist economy.
Absolutely. Their policy calls reflect this directly. They advocate for full automation, universal basic income, and the diminishment of work ethic, basically using tech progress to liberate humanity from mandatory labor.
But there's a critique from within their own ranks, isn't there?
A vital one. Left-X sometimes uses concepts like inhumanism and the liquidation of the human in their rhetoric. They argue that the rational system has to override subjective human experience.
And the worry is?
The worry is that this rejection of humanism risks mirroring Nick Land's ideas, that it could allow for human subjugation in the name of technical, rational progress, regardless of the stated socialist goal.
The complexity of that view stands in stark contrast to the most dangerous, purely nihilistic form we have to talk about: militant accelerationism, or MA.
Yes.
This seems less about high-level philosophy and more about immediate organized violence aimed at pure collapse.
Militant accelerationism is the violent extreme. It's an explicitly syncretic ideology that fuses violent extremism, neo-Nazism, neo-fascism, white nationalism, with that philosophical desire to hasten the total collapse of the existing liberal political system by any means necessary.
The goal is just failure.
Total societal failure leading to chaos from which they believe a white ethno-state can be built.
And this isn't just a domestic issue, it's explicitly transnational, it's coordinated.
That's critical to understanding the threat. MA operates globally. Platforms like the notorious Iron March Forum, which ran from 2011 to 2017, created international networks that spawned real-world terror groups.
Like the Atomwaffen Division.
Atomwaffen Division, National Action in the UK. We see intentional collaboration across borders, like between the Nordic resistance movement and the Russian imperial movement. They use these geographically agnostic online spaces, especially encrypted platforms like Telegram, to overcome local boundaries and coordinate their messaging.
And this brings us to our second major focus area. We need to analyze the profound political and social implications of these movements globally. When they advocate for deliberately hastening crises, how does that actually impact democratic institutions, public policy, and even international relations? How does MA actively undermine democratic structures?
Well, MA's strategy is sophisticated because it focuses on exacerbating latent social divisions. It doesn't really try to create new ideological recruits from scratch.
They see society as a dry forest that's ready to burn.
That's a perfect metaphor. They intentionally exploit highly polarizing issues: gun control, immigration, LGBTQ plus rights to fuel social antagonism, and just destabilize public discourse. They also systematically infiltrate pre-radicalized online spaces, so incel communities, school shooter fandoms. They use them as force amplifiers to intensify mobilization toward violence.
Because the core belief is that there's no political solution.
Absolutely none. Only violence can purify the system. And this violence isn't random. It's formalized into a terrifying strategic framework.
Based on the manifestos of the attackers themselves.
That's right. MA activity is often organized into three strategic pathways. First, you have the movement, which is just the general ideological propagation and recruitment. Second, you have active resistance, which is characterized by the saints culture.
The saints culture.
Yeah.
What does that entail, and how does that sort of ritualized reverence function politically?
It's the mechanism of linkage. It involves the intentional sanctification of mass killers, figures like Brenton Tarrant in Christchurch, Juraj Kručík in Bratislava, or Anders Breivik.
So they turn these individual lone actor events into part of a larger movement.
A coherent apocalyptic movement. By revering these killers as saints, they link isolated acts of terror into a continuous ideological war against the state. It provides a shared history, a motivation, and a pantheon for a global movement that otherwise has no central command structure.
And what's the third path?
A third is passive resistance. This is covert activity. It's focused on survivalism and preparation for the inevitable post-collapse society.
So these are the people getting ready for the end of the world.
These are the individuals or small groups, like the Wolves of Vinland, focused intensely on combat preparedness, survival skills, and establishing these rural, resilient communities. They presume they'll be the natural leaders in the chaotic rebirth phase after the state disintegrates.
And the most direct way for them to hasten that collapse is by physically targeting the system's most vulnerable points, our critical infrastructure.
It is their favored method. Targeting infrastructure, power grids, telecommunications, water supply is seen as the most effective way to achieve widespread societal destruction, to guarantee chaos and anarchy. And we have seen specific, dangerous examples of this strategy being implemented.
Like the incident in San Jose, California.
Exactly. The 2013 sniper attack on the PG&E Metcalf transmission substation in San Jose. That was a military-style raid. Multiple snipers firing high-powered rifles, disabling 17 transformers.
This wasn't just vandalism.
Not at all. It was a sophisticated attempt to shut down a huge portion of Silicon Valley's power supply. Similarly, Groups in the Boogaloo movement have been tied to plots to destroy public utility installations, and we've seen numerous arrests related to bombing power transformers across Idaho and surrounding states.
These acts are designed to trigger widespread infrastructure failure.
And this physical sabotage is reinforced by weaponized conspiracy and disinformation.
So ideological chaos is just as effective as physical sabotage.
The modern accelerationist realizes this. Domestic security agencies have warned that violent extremists are aspiring to disrupt electric and communications infrastructure while, at the same time, spreading false, destabilizing narratives. The 5G COVID-19 conspiracy theory is the perfect example.
That was the idea that 5G cellular technology was somehow linked to the virus, or that it would activate microchips in vaccines.
That's the one. The theory, sometimes with elements claiming 5G would activate microchips implanted by a global elite, directly inspired a wave of arson and sabotage attacks on cellular towers across the US, Europe, and the UK in 2020.
This is accelerationism in action.
Absolutely. Using public panic and conspiratorial thinking to physically damage the very infrastructure society depends on. And critically, some neo-Nazi Telegram channels openly instructed users to promote and weaponize the 5G conspiracy.
Why that specific conspiracy theory?
Because it's a low-friction entry point for radicalization. These channels recognized that it was far easier to convince potential recruits that a 5G tower was silently killing them than it was to try and convince them that the Holocaust never happened.
The goal isn't ideological purity.
The goal is chaos. Promoting the 5G narrative served the accelerationist strategy by eroding public trust in science and government while simultaneously giving them justification for attacks on basic services. It directly contributes to the instability that the militants need to engineer the collapse.
We've seen that accelerationism, whether it's from militants or the techno-elite, relies on actively engineering chaos. But this radical action is often rationalized by leaning on theories that suggest history is pre-programmed, making their actions feel inevitable, or even mandatory. Which brings us back to the theory mentioned in our opening, the Strauss-Howe generational theory, or the fourth turning.
The fourth turning theory provides the perfect deterministic worldview to support the accelerationist rationale. It argues that Anglo-American history follows these roughly 80 to 90-year cycles, which they call sacula.
And each cycle has 4 distinct parts, the turnings.
Exactly. Each saculum is comprised of 4 21-year turnings, always culminating in a crisis of existential national consequence.
Let's just break down those 4 turnings that are supposed to repeat, like clockwork.
Certainly. First, you have the high. This is a period after a major crisis where institutions are strong, there's a collective consensus, and individualism is weak.
Like the post-World War II era.
The post-WWII American high, roughly 1946 to 1964, is the perfect example. Then comes the awakening. This is a period when the established institutional order comes under attack in the name of spiritual autonomy, countercultural idealism.
The consciousness revolution of the 60s and 70s.
1964 to 1984 in their model. Then the system starts to break down in the third phase. That's the unraveling.
Institutions are weak, individualism is strong.
Right. Trust evaporates, society drifts into culture wars, cynical pragmatism. They map this to the neoliberalism era from 1984 through 2008.
And finally, you get the crisis, the fourth turning.
The moment of existential threat where collectivism reemerges and the nation is forced to confront its survival. Historically, they point to the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II.
And according to this theory, we are in a crisis period right now. It started around 2008.
Precisely. They mark the current crisis as starting with the Great Recession, later joined by events like the COVID-19 pandemic, the rise of domestic extremism, and the Russo-Ukrainian War. The current cycle is projected to last until around 2033.
So the appropriation of this by accelerationists is immediately obvious. If the crisis is inevitable, why not speed it up? Shorten the agony, force the regenerative system update faster.
That is the core rationale. If history is truly unavoidable, if destiny is predetermined, then the most rational act is to exert your agency by rushing through the predicted painful collapse to get to the regenerative high sooner.
And this certainty is really alluring.
Incredibly, especially to people who want to rationalize radical action. And this theory is highly influential in the tech world. Figures like Peter Thiel, Curtis Yarvin, and others connected to Silicon Valley have publicly adopted the fourth turning concept to rationalize their radical visions for dismantling political structures.
And yet this theory is extremely contentious among professional historians and political scientists. Which brings us to our third area of focus. We need to examine the critiques of these deterministic cyclical theories of history,
Yes.
like the four turnings and their contemporary appropriation by these ideologies to rationalize, intentionally dismantling social structures for some perceived future progress.
The reception of the Strauss-Howe theory is not just mixed. It's largely negative within serious academic history. While some might praise its ambition to find patterns, it's widely criticized by historians, political scientists, and sociologists as a form of pseudoscience.
And the critique boils down to a few key points.
It does. Firstly, it's just overly deterministic. It tries to force the rich, messy, contingent nature of human history into a rigid, non-negotiable cycle. Historians argue that this just leads to circular reasoning. You force the data to fit the cycle rather than letting history reveal its own path.
And maybe most damningly, it's considered non-falsifiable.
Exactly. Because the boundaries of the turnings and the nature of the crisis are so vaguely defined, you can retrospectively slot almost any major event into the framework. There's no way for the theory to ever be proven wrong. It has no real predictive power in a scientific sense.
I remember Peter Turchin, who studies long-term historical cycles himself, had a very sharp critique of this.
He did. Turchin uses quantitative modeling, not generational theory, and he explicitly criticized the Strauss-Howe theory, stating that it is more akin to a prophecy.
Not a scientific theory.
Right. He emphasizes that while societies do experience cycles of instability, attributing them strictly to generational behavior and these fixed 80-year timelines forces a kind of metaphysical rigidity onto complex social processes. It gives its adherents the certainty of prophecy, which rationalizes the most extreme actions.
Instead of the caution of scientific inquiry, which promotes systemic management.
Well said.
So, accelerationists are leaning on a theory that is largely rejected by the people who study history for a living. But it gives them the moral certainty that their radical destruction is just helping destiny along.
It's the moral firewall. That's the critical takeaway. If history is moving toward an inevitable collapse, then the violent extremist who sabotages a power grid, or the VC who destabilizes governance through radical tech policy, they can both claim they aren't acting as destructive radicals.
They're acting as moral agents, assisting an unavoidable historical transition, just facilitating the system update.
Exactly.
So this brings us to the convergence point. You have the deterministic models, the massive financial power of the techno-elite, and the nihilistic violence of far-right militants, all aiming at a single target: systemic collapse.
The convergence is profound. And critics view the elite accelerationism we see in Silicon Valley as a specific class strategy. The belief that they need to crash the system is seen as a way to make sure they are perfectly positioned to dominate the rebirth. They're managing a predicted down cycle on their terms.
Ensuring the next high is optimized for their particular vision.
Yes, and the 2.0 system they want to ship is incredibly radical. It challenges the core concepts of the nation-state, democracy, and currency.
It's a fundamental dismantling of liberal modernity.
It is. The figures associated with this wing, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, the philosopher Curtis Yarvin, they've all promoted profoundly anti-democratic ideas. Their visions include moving toward a form of global governance based on a business hierarchy, replacing countries with network states.
Which are essentially borderless, ideologically aligned groups.
Right. And replacing national currencies with crypto-backed tokens, removing monetary policy from the control of governments.
These are not subtle reforms. This is a call for a new aristocracy based on technical competence and financial power.
It's a call for the liquidation of the existing political consensus. And this liquidation impulse, when you marry it to the rationalist drive, sometimes surfaces in truly disturbing proposals. It reveals the brutal, anti-human calculation inherent in this philosophy when it's taken to its extreme.
And we have to address the specific chilling detail related to Curtis Yarvin here, contextualizing it as a sourced example of this kind of elite dehumanization.
It is a critical, though disturbing, example of where this kind of hyper-rationalist accelerationism can lead. We're referring to the specific proposal attributed to Curtis Yarvin. It suggested, in the context of efficiency and maximizing systemic utility, the possibility of killing poor people with low social credit scores and turning them into biofuel.
It's almost unbelievable to say out loud.
It is. But that detail, extreme as it is, perfectly illustrates the willingness within certain elite accelerationist circles to completely liquidate human value, the human misfires, for the sake of a purely rational, accelerated, and efficient future system. It exposes the cold calculus that's hiding under the claims of universal abundance.
That disturbing detail just throws that initial paradox into such sharp, immediate focus. You have elites who are the chief beneficiaries of peak stability, actively seeking its liquidation.
That contradiction is the central tension of our time. They're all seeking to force a radical, rapid transition, but they're aiming for radically different outcomes. For the techno-elite, the acceleration is for a rationalist, post-human utopia of material abundance and infinite intelligence. For the militant far-right, acceleration aims for immediate racial conflict, ethnostates, and a return to perceived supremacy.
And yet, the common thread across all these forms, left, right, and techno-capitalist, it remains the same.
It is the absolute shared conviction that the current political and social system is beyond reform. It's beyond patching. It must be violently, rapidly, and deliberately destroyed or forced into collapse. The ideology moves beyond just passively preparing for the future. It is the active attempt to program history itself, viewing the present as merely disposable source code.
We started this deep dive with that anecdote about someone wanting to program history to wipe the server and install a 2.0 version. What we've learned is that this isn't just a metaphor for a few radicals. It's a full-fledged philosophical framework, highly influential, spanning from well-funded venture capitalists to isolated, violent extremists, all operating on the premise that the structure of modern democratic society must be broken.
And that is precisely why the stakes of this mindset are so profoundly high. Accelerationism, whether it is fueled by utopian technological zeal, nihilistic racist violence, or radical financial ambition, relies on one underlying proposition: that the solution to societal problems is not compromise, inclusion, or slow democratic processes, but rather deliberate systemic destruction. The convergence of discredited, deterministic historical prophecy, immense technological capability, and organized transnational extremism presents an unprecedented and immediate threat to democratic stability and international relations, transforming ideological extremism into an organized, concerted campaign to engineer global chaos.